Yes.
Does the SOB stand for South Beach?
That's such a great question.
I was afraid to ask.
Really?
At this point, I should know. I don't know.
Were you aware of the fear?
Yes.
Did you notice it coming and then taking hold and then going?
I mean, it was very mild fear. I would call it actually a slight apprehension.
Did you notice the self-consciousness about feeling like people in the room are going to think, oh my God, Josh is afraid of asking a question, and so then you said what you just said?
No.
Perhaps, see, that would have been, that's the...
Well, I was thinking similar, but I was thinking Professor Rogers probably thinks, how could 7 weeks in, he doesn't know, he looks at it every time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then it's the same question, though. And again, this gets back to the thing that we talked about 3 weeks ago, where you were like, you sort of were but missed. I understand that you had that thought. Were you aware that that thought was arising, having an impact on your physiological sort of state that prompted you to gratuitously, because I didn't say, how would you rate the fear? You felt the need or the desire to sort of to correct. Does that make a little sense?
That does make sense. I didn't think that way.
Right. And so you just said it.
Yeah.
Right? And to Paul Singerman's point, you could have been aware, but this happens so fast. And I do it all the time, so please know that we have the opportunity to learn from these little moments, and hopefully they mean a little more now than they would have the first week, and hopefully you're okay being the voice of reason and wisdom to be able to see these things more clearly. Years ago when I came up with this idea based on an experience that I had with nature that prompted it, and then it evolved over many years of sort of refining it, because I live on Miami Beach and sort of somewhat south. The idea was tree and wind and clouds and sun, and how beautiful is that? South Beach. And of course there were things like Sobe Tattoo and Sobe, all these places were opening up. So it just sort of made sense that, and the larger lesson though is if you want to be mindful, so be mindful. Right? That's really one of the big takeaways of our class. You want to be mindful? So be mindful. We're halfway in, a little bit more, and if you're still thinking, I got to do this thing, I got to do this mindful, then be aware of the impulse and the feelings and the thoughts of got to do. And then you're freed from it to some extent. But it's so ingrained in us to got to do. It takes hold. It mobilizes us. It has served us well even. That to actually see it, to notice it at a distance, to be on the balcony while we're experiencing it is extremely challenging, especially for conditioned states that are so core to who we think we are. So you want to be mindful, so be mindful. And let's let the elements of South Beach, or some of the elements of South Beach, be the cue. And you may notice I live on the water, as I've shared with you all, but the waves aren't there. We could have had it where you look at the waves, and the waves represent what? Thoughts, right? The waves, it's a nice metaphor. The waves are thoughts. Sometimes our thoughts are choppy and all over the place, very busy. Sometimes the waves are and our thoughts are more subtle and smooth and not quite so racy. And then, of course, there's an interesting, I think it's an interesting story of a person looking out over the ocean and saying, oh my God, look how big that is. Look how vast that is. And the other person saying, yeah, and that's just the surface. Right? So the waves represent sort of the thoughts that are coming and going and just coming and going. And it's the nature. You're not going to have an ocean. We've got to get rid of the waves. That's not going to happen. And it wouldn't serve the earth well. And then there's the depth, right? The body of the vastness, which isn't as necessarily as the surface. So what we're sort of exploring is this is the surface. Oh my gosh. And it has all sorts of nature, moments of its own nature. because we're all interconnected. The waves aren't there on the surface of the ocean just because. They're there because of an interconnectedness of a larger environmental landscape. And it can be, it's another conversation. But if our mind is busy and racing, it's not because we've been sitting in a cave by ourselves for 23 years and somehow this thing, no, we've been interacting with others and we've been reading the papers and we've been engaging in the world, and there's a reason why. And we have a physiology and we have an upbringing and we have, but not everybody in the world, Josh, has an ocean. So the So Be Mindful elements were chosen because pretty much anywhere in the world that somebody happens to be, they will have a tree, and the wind, and clouds, and the sun. They will hear birds. And the butterfly is tricky. What's meant ultimately, as we did a little bit, is you're out there, and hopefully now it'll be a little bit more than it was before. You'll be walking, and you'll just sort of see a tree, and you'll be like, oh yeah. And you don't have to do anything. You can just be like, oh yeah, right, I'm here. Like, it's just a wake up. It's just a wake up. And hopefully you now begin to realize more that, oh yeah, what that means is, it means, where was my mind a moment earlier? I have no idea where my mind was necessarily. So when we wake up, we sort of wake up out of a mind-wandering state that probably was worrying about the future, thinking about the future, caught in the future, even excited about the future. You're not here. You missed. Did you see that sunrise? No, I was so excited about. So it's not like it's got to be a problematic state. It's just one where we're somewhere else. And it's not like it's even a problem to be having those states. But when you begin to wake up out of them, you can begin to make more of your own decision about the utility of where you were a moment earlier and what you open up to. And these are just invitations to get to know ourselves a little better. It's not like you got to say, oh, I see trees and I say, screw that. Like, I don't think that's a problem. But if you're aware of the impulse and the thoughts and the feelings about why you would make that decision, then Paul Singerman would be happy, because you're making an informed decision, because you've woken up out of the impulse to interrupt. And now maybe you will, maybe you won't, but you're making that decision for yourself on behalf of your client or whomever. Okay, so today we're going to spend a little bit more time on what I think is a really, really, really important article for you all for a lot of reasons, because it is a great integration of mindfulness and an aspect of the practice of law, negotiation, and a particular technique. You'll be learning lots of techniques. You'll be going to CLE conferences and events, and you'll be learning how to do this and that, and you'll be learning lots of things. And then the question is, can you deliver on what you've learned as skillfully and effectively as you'd like to? And so we'll spend a bit of time on this, and I've just pulled out 3 or 4 pages so we can go through certain sections closely and carefully together, and I printed it out so that you could all be looking at it also to really impress upon you. But I think this is a very helpful article for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll talk about today. I also just yesterday was thinking, you know what might be neat? And I put together this thing for you. So if you would, let's take out this, and we'll spend a few minutes looking at the other side, not the landscape, which we'll get to today, I hope, but the other side. So here we have it. Pretty much everything that we have learned, or at least used to learn. So on the top right, the bar articles, Paul Singerman, Patton Hyman, Judy Cohen, and we could look at those 3. Those are 3 written for lawyers expressions of the usefulness of mindfulness for lawyers. And they do it in different ways, and you've got different things out of them. And this is a reminder. You have read 3 pieces that are front and center. Mindfulness for lawyers, slightly different perspectives and ways of articulating it. Then you've got these 4 pieces that I've contributed to the ABA GP Solo magazine on this column that I do. And we've touched on a couple. And we have 1 or 2 that going to the balcony that are sort of front and center for us to touch on today a little bit and to continue to explore. Then you've got these 2 law review articles that we've done. Professor George, The Cure for the Distracted Mind, very much right up your alleys. It's been written about law school and law students. We read a handful of pages from that, but know that that's there for you to explore more. And I will assign some more pages in the weeks to come. We'll come back to it. Leonard Riskin, this is the piece that we'll talk about today. So these are law review articles and bar articles that are mindfulness and law. And if you notice the little, well, we'll come back to that. Then we've got mindfulness readings. Dan Harris, what he did this week. Michael Singer, which many of you have articulated that you found very interesting and helpful. Anna Konikova, the New York Times on breathing. William Ury, Don't React, Go to the Balcony. The piece that I wrote with my father on mindful listening. And John Kabat-Zinn, Mindfulness for Beginners, the book and the various things. We've read those, and we're going through those. And we've got the podcast that we'll talk about a little bit, and you all commented on, from the 10% Happier podcast. That's also an invitation to you to know there's a podcast with all these interesting people. You will find some that you find interesting. I guarantee if you go to that 10% Happier thing, whether it's Tim Ferriss or whether it's people in the military or whether it's what's his name? Interesting figures from all sort of starts. And his first question is, tell me about what got you interested in meditation. Right? And everyone's got a slightly different relationship to it. Some are like all in, and some are like dancing around it, and some don't have much. But they've all got something interesting to talk about. So this is sort of on the right-hand side where we are. And then this week, coming up, we have another law review article, Mindfulness and Law, A Path to Well-Being and Balance for Lawyers and Law Students. I think you'll find it very interesting. And I'll also be assigning it in pages so we can attend to things that are front and center for us. But also know that as you're working on your papers, as you're thinking about your papers, which we'll talk about today, you've got these more thoughtful pieces, right, to look through, to help you find resources that you might not otherwise find, and ideas. Then in the left-hand side, we've got our metaphors, the flashlight and the light bulb, which also has the sun I put over the light bulb. We've got the snow globe, the spiral, the balcony. We've got the landscape of the mind, which is on the flip side, which we haven't really turned to yet, but we will. We've got the building blocks of awareness, attention, the object, and solitude. We've got the so be mindful elements, and we've traipsed through those today. And then in the center, we've got various insights, and you all have your own additional insights to offer, but these are the ones that we've explored. The latter two are part of a quote or part of a poem. We've got the practices we've learned. We've learned 4 primary practices: the focused attention, body scan, mindful walking, and mindful listening. We've got some techniques. We've got the various chapters that we read earlier on in particular, and we've got the songs. So why do you think I share this with you now, a little bit over halfway through? Because it took me a couple hours to put this together. Yeah.
Maybe for us to appreciate everything we've done and to have like a checklist in case we need to like reconsider a different mindfulness practice or technique.
Okay, we say checklist. So yes, to look at what we've done. Yeah, I want you all to see what we've done. Right? It's sort of a lot in a way, but it's also manageable in a way. If you were to add up all the pages, it actually wouldn't be all that much given 7 weeks into a class. But it's not easy to keep track of it. So you said to check in or to keep track. Yes, all of these things should mean something to you. I use the word should, I don't like the word should. So replace it with a better word. If you look at this and you're like, what was that? Go back and find out what that was. What was the takeaway from that? Or what could have been one of the takeaways? It's not that much. We're halfway through. And you might have been like, oh, I forgot. I never got to that one. Also, you'll see how I have like the light, the sun. If we look at the so be mindful elements, the tree, the breath, thoughts and feelings, there's the cloud subtly to the left, warmth and awareness for the sun, the bird sound, and the butterfly gratitude. I sort of plopped those along the way. I could have done it for every single thing you see. But for the mindfulness practices, for example, what do we see with the focused attention practice? Which elements did I identify explicitly? In the center, focused attention. Which 2 elements and this other metaphor did I apply to it?
Warmth and awareness, the breath, and flashlight.
Okay, so let's put aside warmth. We're using the sun there for awareness primarily, but it certainly could be warmth. Right, we've got awareness, we've got the breath, and we've got the flashlight. Now, why is that? Why is that? How does that sort of identify the focused attention practice that we've learned?
The breath is the object of our attention.
Breath is the object.
We're supposed to be aware of the thoughts, feelings.
We're aware of
arising.
thoughts and feelings, things coming along.
And the flashlight, I thought the flashlight was also supposed to be our attention, but
Well, when you said the wind, you sort of clumped the things together. So say the wind again and tease it apart. You said the wind is to be aware of our breath, or to pay attention to our breath. But the wind is really the breath is really the object. And then the flashlight is
our attention.
our attention. Very nice. So we have our attention on an object. The object in this case happens to be the breath, as the primary one for that practice, but it could be something else. And we are aware. Very nice. The tricky part there is the aware part. Right? And what about the body scan that we did last week? And we'll talk about it in just a few moments. How is the body scan identified?
The tree is the body.
Tree is the body.
Flashlight is bringing awareness.
Flashlight is bringing awareness.
And then the sun is the awareness.
Right. Right. Very similar, isn't it? One thing different. Breath versus body. And we could even perhaps find out that those two have much more in common than we might even think. Mindful walking, which we did out there. What was that? If you haven't spoken, this is a good time.
Body.
Body, which in a particular part of the body, right? The roots, right, so to speak. And
Thoughts and feelings.
well, that's interesting. So what do we see here? We could add clouds because they inevitably come, but they're not the instructional part, right? We could add it. All of these, by the way, can have all of them. So as Chris was pointing out, they all could have all. But just in terms of the core instruction, what are we doing with the body? In this case, the legs, the feet, with the flashlight. We are turning our attention to it. And then, if Dylan reminds us, and when we're aware when our mind wanders, or we're aware of thoughts and feelings, this would be the clouds, so we could have the clouds out there also, right? But we could be aware of lots of things, right? And then the mindful listening. What is this one? Who wants to take a stab at it? Yes, Jessie.
Sound,
Sound, the bird, good. And what are we doing with the sound?
focusing our attention to the sound.
Good, that's the flashlight.
And being aware of our body.
Yes, very nice. That takes it to a whole nother level, right? Because we could have mindful listening just be I'm listening to that person, they're the object of my attention, my mind wanders, I come back. But we know that if we're really paying attention, they will say something that we didn't want to hear. And in addition to a thought that might be like, I don't want to hear that, although usually it's a very different thought, there will be something here that we're experiencing. This is where we're really interested in paying attention. Very, very nice. So I put it in a couple of other places, but really, and technically if we had the time, but you may want to do this, awareness in the middle on the left is in yellow, and then attention is in blue, and the object is in purple, and you could take 3 crayons and you could go to pretty much every single thing on here. And you could sort of color and just part of it in colors and have colors all over this place. And so why do I share that? Why do we explore this at this stage? Now that we've really gotten a lot of mindfulness under our belts of practice and reading. Yes.
For me, it's enormously helpful to have like an authority organize it for me, because at this point you've given us a lot of these tools, but I remember bits and pieces of it as I go, and then I can't remember, is this a technique, practice, so it helps to kind of push me back into structure.
Yes, good. And that's what's intended, for you to be able to reflect on this. Not so you can remember it or something. There's no test on this. So that you can go, oh yeah, I get it. And that you can draw lines connecting it. This too shall pass. What is that? What element is that of nature? What element does that remind us of? The clouds. Thoughts are not facts. Clouds. But not just clouds, because if you're going to know that the thought isn't a fact, you also have to be what? Aware. Do you have to be paying attention to know a thought is not a fact? Not necessarily. You just have a thought, you're aware, There you go. Any questions about this? Okay. So let us do a sitting practice for just 3 minutes, a 3-minute sitting practice. It's going to be an invitation. I'm going to leave you more in silence than say, but I'll say just a little bit. But the practice is going to be this, building a little bit on what we did last time we were here. After we get sort of settled and situated, and I'll say rest your attention on the sensations of the breath. When you notice your mind wandering, gently return to the breath. You might decide to count those breaths. Putting an internal 1 as you inhale, and 1 on you exhale, and 2 as you inhale, and 2 as you exhale, to sort of cover the sensation of the breath with a count. You could also do it a little different. You could have it where on the inhale you go in, and it's just this in. And then as you exhale, out. In, out. You may find that, among other things, it can be helpful for staying with it. Like you've got sort of 2 things coming together that are really close. They're so close that it's not like, look at the exit sign as you say 1 and think to yourself, exit, right? Or, as you exit. I mean, it's like, no, they're very close. And that can be helpful or interesting for a variety of reasons, or just notice the sensations of the breath. All right, so let's bring ourselves into a posture that's upright and stable. As we lower or close the eyes, whichever you prefer. Taking a few slower, deeper breaths. With the intention for this practice to rest your attention on the sensations on the breath as you know this breath, and when you notice your mind wandering, to gently return. Even if you're saying the count or in and out, it's a light touch. It's just enough energy and effort to be with the breath, but not more. It's like a butterfly on a flower. The wind might be blowing just enough to stay on the flower and then to return. It's not a grasping of the flower, it's not a grasping of the breath. mind wanders, you realize. If you notice yourself gripping, clenching, tight eyes, jaw, shoulders, belly. And when you're ready in the next moment or two, with an awareness of doing so, lifting the gaze, opening the eyes. All right, Paul Singerman. We spent a little time with Paul. He really enjoyed spending time with you all. He made that very clear to me. What were some of the things that you found most interesting, that you still are reflecting on, that you somehow carried with you beyond the end of that time with Paul?
You mentioned about losing your edge. I think it's a lot of questions from young attorneys and people who talk about meditation about if I'll lose my edge. And I found that interesting because I know we've been kind of talking about how law school cultivates you to be this kind of aggressive person, you know, overworked, and that people really do fear that that's the edge. I mean, my personal opinion, I don't think there's anything edgy about being overworked and stressed, but that's really what some of us try to do.
Well, it's interesting. That's great. Right. Will I lose my edge? And the key word that I think I heard you just say, Maria, is over. Over. Right? To be overworked. To be over aggressive, you know, whatever that might be. Which is to suggest some level of reactivity. Right? Being more caught in it than we need to be effective. In fact, the more caught, if you remember the inverted U, might be taking us to the other side of our performance as performance drops. So let's talk about that for a little bit, because it's a great question. And I mean from your own direct experience, losing our edge through this mindfulness practice. What are some of the things that you think support that? Like, yeah, maybe so. And what would be some of the things that you think might be like, no, not necessarily, or no, not at all?
Well, one thing I remember Paul talking about was, you know, we have this idea that being mindful is necessarily being kind of almost meek or timid, but he was talking about that mediation that he was doing where he made it a point, and this was more in the context of not interrupting, but I think it's somewhat on point here, where he raised his voice and interjected and kind of made his presence known. So I don't think that mindfulness is mutually exclusive with being able to assert yourself. That's just kind of it seems to be a misconception about the practice.
Right, and so let's touch on that for a moment. That's really important. Because for us, it would be like, well, what's the talisman? What's the indicator of when it's out of proportion as opposed to in proportion, right? I mean, if you're sitting there and opposing counsel at a party as, you know, being manipulative and deceptive and sort of like, you know, trying to, and you're aware of that, so, well, I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate that you're probably feeling frustrated in this process, and, oh yeah, that's right, not appreciated. Say more. I mean, that would be an overreaction. That would probably be an overreaction in the other way. It would be an abdication of. And if we think about William Urey's going to the balcony and the three sort of ways that we can overreact, which one would it be if you remember them? Strike back? Would that be striking back? No. Retreat. Right? That's an overreaction. Or to just give in. That can sometimes look like a compromise. Sometimes giving in or compromising is the exact right thing to do, and sometimes it's an abdication of responsibility. Sometimes being firm and intentional and deliberate and using the voice and using whatever that is, whether it's done as a sort of a little bit of theater, or whether it, as I would suggest to you, it just arises. Did I give you all the quote? We can add it to our thing. Do you have the patience to wait till the mud settles? Did I share this all with you? And I saw John, your hand, and I saw your hand, David. Well, do you have the patience to wait till the mud settles? You see a metaphor in here, one of our three metaphors? Waiting for the mud to settle. Right? Do you have the patience to wait for the snow globe to settle? But this goes back to the Tao Te Ching, a very important book from the Taoist tradition that's 2,700 years old. Snow globes, I think, are more recent vintage. Do you have the patience to wait till the mud settles? Till and the water is what?
Still, calm,
Clear. All of those would be nice though. Clear. Do you have the patience to wait till the mud settles? And the water is clear. Remember? Which reading is this? The dessert topping, right? Or the taste that tastes great, or floor wax. See things more clearly. And if the mud is settled, what's probably going to happen? How's it going to taste? A little bit more sweet. Right? But this is the key that builds on. And the water is clear. Till the right action. Right? So that would be what Paul Singerman's pointing to. That's what you're speaking to. The right action, right? The most useful, the most skillful action. What do you all think comes next? In fact, take a few moments, turn to, well, what do you think comes next? Because this last line is the thing. This is all really useful. This last line is the thing. What could it be? Do you have the patience? Try not to scurry your way to an answer. Let's let being present with a mind that will do. Trust me, your mind will, the wheels are turning. You don't have to turn them. Do you have the patience to wait till the mud settles and the water is clear, till the right action, what? Presents itself, is obvious. What else?
The
Hmm?
right action is
Is clear
clear for you.
for you?
Moves you.
Hmm? Moves you. Right. Moves you. What else? Well, those are all terrific and all very responsive. Arises by itself. Right? This. And you all know these moments, right? You're talking to somebody and somehow you say the thing and like, oh my God, thank you so much. And you weren't thinking it through like, oh, I got to come up with something to say. Or you're taking the test and somehow you're like reading and all of a sudden, oh, right? The aha moment, right? But it doesn't come out of nowhere. And some of them take years and years of learning and exploring and gathering information. Einstein didn't come up with E equals MC squared out of nothing. But it might have been that there were moments of, in fact, Einstein said The intellect has little to do on the road to discovery. This is Einstein. The intellect has little to do on the road to discovery. There comes this leap in consciousness, called intuition if you will, and the answer comes to you and you don't know how or why. Rises by itself. Can we create the environment within ourselves? What does the snow globe look like when this happens? Right? We have a sense. And it's not that there's no snow, because that's not, there's always waves, right? There's always snow. There's always activity. Thank goodness. And there's also a depth, a body, a largeness to who we are that can draw upon the thoughts that come along and the feelings, but aren't only them, so much more. When we do the body scan, we're inhabiting the more of that. There's this. This isn't going because of thoughts. Could you imagine what it would be like if you were you had no connection to your body, which some people don't, in terms of feeling it. You have no connection to your body. And I'm not speaking for their experience. This is just metaphorical or a sort of a thought experiment. So your heart rate's not going to go up because of something that happens. Because whatever happens, it's not, you can't. I think people's heart rates do go up. So this is just a scenario where you just are not in contact with your body. And then somebody cuts you off in traffic, right? Or pick your snow globe moment. The supervisor does this, and you're just like, well, they probably shouldn't have done that, or that was rude, or you'll have the thought, but there's nothing to grip you, right? It's not the thoughts. They're part of the snow globe experience, part of the spiral. But without the others, the feelings of the sensations. And so too, when somebody goes, guess what I got you? And you're like, oh my God, they got me this really nice present. That's so nice of them. Thank you. And sometimes we are so caught up in that we don't really have. So this body scan is really inviting us. Even the So Be Mindful practice that I share with you is a movement practice. And there's many movement practices. Yoga is a mindful movement practice. You don't need to, if you're a big yoga person, but when you're outside, I think that there's some benefits that can come from having those associations made on a regular basis. So yes, you can do it. Paul might say I'm very deliberate about what I'm doing. I think that there's good cause for that, to have that problem-solving analytical capacity freed up. But also, I would suggest to you that the additional gift is to have that capacity. So it's almost like put yourself into manual transmission, right? I'm going to figure this out, and I've got this capacity, and even though I'm going really fast, and even though the cars are really close to me, I can do this because I'm steady. I'm present. And to also have it where the car is, you're just doing it. It's just happening. You were gonna add something to add, David?
I think we were talking about the Paul Singerman saying that people are always worried about losing their edge, and I think that it's actually the opposite of that. I think that mindfulness is actually a very sharpening practice in a way, because it causes you to be really attentive, and that if you don't have that, you just get kind of, I guess the benefit of being able to get wrapped up in your emotions is that it reads as really true when you express anger in a really particular way. I think people feel that, but anger is kind of like, when you did the spiral drawing, you did a fire, right? So it's as hurtful to you as it is to anything outside of you. And so it kind of blunts your edge in that sense as well.
Okay, so interesting. Well, okay, I love that. You put that out there. It's worth considering. It might be quite true. I would suggest to you that when something happens that's wrong, an injustice, a misrepresentation, a manipulation, and you feel a spark of anger, I don't want to not feel that spark of anger. I don't want to not feel that very genuine, authentic, momentary thing. That does not get the spiral going. That lights the match. And then does the spiral start going. To be able to, this gets into like, what does that mean? But the body scan is very helpful here to be able to process that. To have that spark arise, that flash of anger, when the water is clear, or to have it unsettle the water a little bit because the spiral gets going, but then you're able to reestablish. Then the right action is inspired by the anger. Not despite it, or because you... The challenge, though, is we get angry, and then we have a thought, and we're like, I can't believe that, and that's so wrong, and this is so unfair, and why does the law allow this, and why does the judge not see this? And now we have a spiral. That's a spiral of reactivity. And then the response, which sometimes is helpful because if you're a strike back mode and somebody's in a withdrawal mode, it could serve you well. You probably could have accomplished it and not, depleted your energy and not had too much cortisol flow through your body because it wasn't necessary, but it did the trick that time. The only problem is you're in traffic and there it is doing the trick again, and then you're at home and somebody forgot to, and you're doing the trick again because we're not necessarily having mastery of those moments. So reflect, right? So that's an interesting thing to reflect on. Being authentic and having it where like to feel sad or to feel angry or to feel frustrated or to feel disappointed or to feel that's being a human being. This being a human is a guest house, right? Some momentary awareness arises as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. And have the person you're with be with you in relationship to that. Because they'll have their own response. How wonderful when both people are welcoming and entertaining, mindfully engaged, interested, and we can't ask that of other people. But there will be those moments. And the more we can hold steady, the more we can help others in our midst hold steady because we're not feeding their spirals. Or if we are, we're doing it deliberately, and sometimes I think there's good cause for making those sorts of decisions to actually get somebody more agitated. But it's deliberately. It's not done just to make them suffer because you're suffering. And that's very different. Nice, important, thank you. Anything to add to that? John, you had something that you wished to raise your hand initially.
Yes, so just switching gears here. Paul reiterated the initial skepticism that many of us feel towards mindfulness once we start exploring it.
Yeah, so that hearing him speak to that was useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I was a huge skeptic and borderline critic when this class started. And so to hear someone in his position and his status of his experience, to know that his starting place was similar to mine, and something I could relate to, and it gives the whole subject more credibility.
Good. I'm glad. I hope it doesn't answer the question for you, but invites a more engaged, curious, interested, what is this? That has somebody who I respect greatly, and many do, find it to be useful to them. Good. I'm glad. Yes, Grace.
Also, on the question of why it might seem like one of us listening movies for Ed, using this mud and water, I guess, metaphor, because I asked Paul about that really contentious, opposing situation, what do you do then? And I can see how, in a superficial situation, the optics of your opposing counsel is in this, he's swinging mud, and he's going nuts. And the optics, if you're not in the mud with him, can seem as if like, well, why can't you fight back? So I can see how superficially in that moment it would seem as if that person who's practicing mindfulness is not as edgy as this person in mud swinging mud everywhere, when that's just a superficial look of it. So I can see why someone on the outside would be like, that person practicing mindfulness and waiting till the mud settles is not as aggressive as the person in the mud just going nuts. Okay, so it begs a very interesting question. Does anybody want to comment on that? Because I have a comment on that very
keen, I think very logical and apt response. Anybody want to have a response to what Joyce just said? So let me ask you some questions if I may. And feel free to hold. Feel free to have every conversation we have, just plant seeds to consider and reflect on, not to resolve anything. I'm always reconsidering everything, I would say, always and everything. Be careful when you use those words. I would say the way I heard you say that suggested to me that the waiting till the mud to settle or having the water be clear looks a certain way. I don't think it looks a certain way. I think it looks a different way and feels a different way based on every different situation. So if we have a belief that to be wise and reflective and compassionate and kind and patient looks like something, and that something is probably in the direction of not as emotive and not as loquacious and not as energetic, then I would say that I would want to explore that. And the way we explore that is say, well, let me find ways of helping my mud settle so that my water is clear. Mindfulness practices are one vehicle for doing so. And then let me see what I'm like when somebody says something that is really wonderful or somebody says something that's really, disturbing. And I would suggest to you that in theory, the response is very much connected to that scenario, which didn't, by the way, begin with the thing that you think. It began before that, and before that, and before that. But we're taking it for what it is in that moment. It's like, there's a martial art form called, and probably many martial arts forms and other explorations of humanness can connect with this, called Aikido. Anybody familiar with Aikido? A-I-K-I-D-O? Which is where the energy's coming at you, and you don't step out of the way necessarily, and you don't just be like, take it. You actually are so skillful because you're so attuned that you take that energy, right? And literally the person falls over who's coming at you, and you didn't exert really anything. You took it and were so responsive. Now, is that waiting for the mud to settle or is that would somebody watch that and go, how the hell did that just happen? Right? And it can happen with words, and it can happen with gestures, and it can happen the next day when you follow up with something because the time to do it, the right action is not arising a day later, although it might. The right action is arising right then, which is that there's no action to take right then. But this is all the promise of what we're exploring. It's for us to know this for ourselves, even if it's just, the gradient. 0 to infinity, and wherever we are, we're just, moving in this direction. Oh my gosh. That person just lied to me, and before I'd be like, why you lying? Now I'm like, I think what I heard you just say seems, my gut feeling is that you just lied to me. I don't think you want to lie to me. I don't want to be in whatever with somebody who's lying to me. I'm feeling really confused. And I understand that maybe you feel a certain way that prompted that. Can we talk about this now or later? I mean, there's a totally different way of exploring that. I'm not saying that next time opposing counsel does it, I was thinking more like, your sibling or something. But even it can be done in other ways. Okay. The time has come. Please, if you would, take out these are just a sampling, not a sampling, these are a select number of pages from this article. So would anybody like to, who didn't speak last time, because we touched on this last time, tell me the big picture. What is happening in this article? What is Leonard Riskin doing? This book comes out, Beyond Reason, Using Emotions as You Negotiate. So I'm going to give you the foundation. Roger Fisher was the primary, was one, the first author of, or one of two authors, I don't know how they did it, but my guess is he was the primary contributor, thought leader of Getting to Yes. Hugely influential book. We touched on it a little bit. Getting to yes. Among other things, there's a technique. You want to get to yes? Move away from positions, drop down, and understand the person's interests. There's a lot of room for connecting and collaborating and finding more win-win, less than two positions that might be so intractable and so at odds with each other that they'll never yield. Somebody would have to change their position. But let's not. Let's look at the interest. How can we satisfy interest? But to do that, we have to know the interest. And we touched on that classic example last week of the orange. Anybody remember that? The orange. Two people are fighting over the orange. They both want the orange. I want the orange. I want the orange. I need the whole orange. I need the whole orange. Those are their positions. They need the whole orange. You're never going to solve that one without somebody attacking and somebody withdrawing and somebody getting in. And having solutions that aren't really workable for both sides, or at least more workable than they might be, it just inevitably comes back to bite you in one way or another. If nothing else, you miss the opportunity to learn how to be more skillful in that, and that will bite you the next time you do another. But one says, well, what's your interest? Why do you need the orange? The juice? Why do you need the orange? The rind? There you go. The right answer arises. Do you have the patience to wait till the mud settles and the water is clear to even ask the question? And that's sort of what, in some ways, this book moves towards. They're saying, you know what? We get these instructions and these techniques in getting to yes. They're very useful. But negotiations are emotionally challenging. And when you're in an agitated, emotionally fraught state, or the other person is, it can be very hard to navigate towards a solution. So they came up with this book, which is really Getting to Yes plus. Getting to Yes plus when there's negative, let's say unpleasant, agitated emotions at play. It's embedded in Getting to Yes, but not as explicitly. And so they come back with this book. And I don't think the word mindfulness is written in this book once. But, if you were to go to Getting to Yes, do you think that a mindful person is more likely to inquire about needs just because they're more mindfully aware without having to know that technique? Yeah. But then Leonard Riskin reads this and he says, well, wait a minute. You might be in an emotional state when you're negotiating. What are the core concerns? Who would like to tell us what the core concerns are? Appreciation. Affiliation. Autonomy. Status. And role. Good. Appreciation. Autonomy. Affiliation, status, and role. And so in this book, they say, look, there's a whole lot of emotions going on, and it's hard to keep track of them. So let's do an indirect connecting with the emotions that we're trying to read in the other person. Almost every emotion can fall into one of these four categories where this tracks it, or more than one of those. So use this as a lens and a lever. We'll get to that in a moment. But then Leonard Riskin comes along and says, yes, but even though you have Getting to Yes, you really sort of need this because of negative emotions that get in the way. And then Leonard Riskin says, yes, but even if you have this, something else might get in the way, for which mindfulness might be helpful. So with that, who would like to speak to what's one of the big lessons? Big picture. We're going to get to the specifics of what Leonard Riskin is sharing with us about the value of mindfulness. Well, let's go through it a little bit. So, Notice that the first thing, we'll go in the order of where I put the colored bars. Okay, so we get. Well, who would like to first tell us, how do you use, in a negotiation, how do we use these? Let's first address that. Dylan.
I think his kind of broad point is that negotiations often break down because your counterparty is, you're not addressing one of those 5 core concerns in some way.
Okay, well, you're not addressing is sort of right, but it's skipping over something. So you're having a negotiation with a counterparty. It's not going well. In particular, it's not going well because of the negative emotions. And as a technique, remember these things. And then do what with them? You have them on a little checklist as you're like talking to the person. You can look down and go, oh yeah, what are you going to do with those?
Think about why the person might not be feeling appreciated, for example, or why the person might not feel like he has autonomy.
Okay, I mean, you're taking it a step further again. First, perhaps, are any of these things low for that person, right? Then wondering why could be a good thing. So yes, so I've got this negotiation. This person's it's not going well. Maybe it's even because of me. Do they feel appreciated? Do they? Right? You got these 5 little things. If it was like, are they angry? Are they frustrated? Are they depressed? Are they agitated? Are they afraid? Or it's like you could have a list of 100 things, right? Good luck with that. But we could branch out of all these and have all these emotions fall in here. So that's why this is a helpful rubric. Okay. And then if you find that, let's do a little negotiation. I really want that blue thing. I'm so afraid of where this is not going to go. Dylan, can I, that was mine. I had it over here. I said, anybody can have this stuff. I didn't mean the blue notebook. I forgot about it. Can I have it back?
No, I actually really like this notebook, and it's the only one of its kind, and I don't think that I think it actually belongs to me.
Okay, I understand that it belongs to you because I said anybody could have it, but Dylan, look, I'm the teacher of the class, okay? Like, I'm working hard, and I just forgot. It slipped my mind that it's there. I slipped my mind when I said, anybody want to take one of these books with you? You can. I forgot that it was there. I didn't mean for it to be taken. What?
So I guess now I'm kind of thinking, okay, maybe he feels like, I don't know, his status is as the professor is being
compromised. Okay, right, that's
perhaps.
possible. Let's go. What's another one? Might not feel appreciated. So the point is not to give me this. The point is to have me more okay, or come up with some other solution. So you might say what to me? What might Dylan say to me in that moment after I finish saying that?
Why do you need the book? Or
Yes. Yes, that's true. But yes, that's certainly a very good thing to ask. But in the spirit of having tracked as a lens, maybe Scott's really, because you want me to be sort of more here, right? In fact, if I'm in this agitated state, you say, why do you need it? I'm like, because I need it. Why do I have to explain everything? Right? So it's a great question to ask. So what could be a thing that's said in response to my not feeling the status or the role or the appreciation? Like Professor Rogers, ...
You're doing a great job as a teacher, and I'll bring you a different blue book next week to show you my appreciation.
Okay. Do we see how we begin to possibly have me, not like we're not gotten to the point of how we're going to resolve it, right? Because maybe ultimately, I'm like, thank you, yes, I still want it. I mean, and then maybe why? And then it's like, because my daughter gave it to me, and then maybe it's like, well, I just liked having something from you. It's like, oh, well, I can give you another one in my office that's from me. Right? Who knows the many ways it could play out, right? So very, very nice. As a lens, we check on these. And then in the way that Paul Singerman would talk about, because this isn't necessarily, this can happen very spontaneously. You see that somebody's not going to appreciate it, and you just sort of say, are you mad? You know, it can happen spontaneously. But here it's a more like deliberate, right? And that's the way Leonard Riskin plays it out between Phil and Jack. Right? It's deliberate. You're dropping it in to help, literally as a lever. You're moving the lever up. Appreciation's low. Let me move it up. And maybe that's something that's a part of the negotiation. You know, in that case, like, okay, you can have that territory. Okay, I feel back in the game. I matter. Or it could be just the way something's being talked about. Hey, would you like some coffee? Right? We've been here a long time. I really appreciate the time you've taken for this. Can I get you something to drink? So that's how it plays out. That's what they talked about here. Leonard Riskin gives you that because he knows you don't have the book. But then what? Even with that, you go into your negotiation. You've got your little core concerns. You've read the book. You've even done it before. You know how it plays out. But then what can get in the way? And he gives us, number 3, the obstacles to implementing the core concerns. And what are these obstacles? He gives us 6. First, we have, just say it, it's easy participation. It's right there in front of you. What? Excessively self-centered perspectives. And he explains why. Why might it be that if Dylan and I are having that conversation and Dylan has this obsessively or excessively self-centered way about him, that it might not allow Dylan to catch these things? Why?
Well, he's only focused on what he wants.
He's just focused on himself, right? Very nice. And then there's number 2, what? Strong negative emotions. And how could that get in the way, right? Well, that's what the whole book is about in the first place, but you could be experiencing those strong negative emotions. Right? You're like, I didn't even see it. My blinders were on. I didn't even see that piece of paper the whole time. I completely forgot about it. There's a saying in the military, no good plan survives the enemy. Right? You can plan it. You can plan all you want. And thank goodness you got to plan when you can. But once it happens, right, no good trial survives opposing counsel's surprise announcement, right? Number 3, C, letter C. What's this one? This one gets really close to what we've been exploring. This is on the first page. Automatic habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. That's like, I don't have it in here, but if you may remember, that's where they draw this, and they have thoughts, feelings, they have literally thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And being so close to them that you can't like see it happening, right? It's like being lost in the snow globe, being lost in the spiral, versus being on the balcony and going, oh yeah. So we have these automatic habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving because the spiral gets going. The thoughts, feelings, and sensations are just like the last time we had an argument with somebody. You know, you're in traffic and somebody cut you off. You're in traffic and somebody cut you off. You're in traffic and somebody cut you off. And you have these, somebody gets angry at you. We have these habitual ways of, that's the overreaction from the spiral. So we don't do the thing that's in front of us as an option that the technique offers because we're just caught in our own conditioned ways of reacting. Does that make sense? By the way, I have a question. In the negotiation realm, you may remember, Grace, talking like this can be very helpful. It can be soothing and satisfying. It can certainly have attention trained. But I'm aware that I'm wearing 2 masks, and you're sort of at a distance. So I'm like, it can be this. Does anybody find that to be like, he's screaming? Please let me know, right? Because I'm conscientious of the fact that our wiring is such that if somebody's, so I want to try to find that. And I've been thinking about this for several weeks because I was thinking I can't wait till we get to the point where we do not have to have. In fact, even being out in the Arboretum, you may have noticed I just wore my little Lincoln Road one. So I've got two of these on. I've got two of them on in part because if I'm here, I'm sensitive also to the fact that you may be thinking, well, I'm younger than Scott, probably. But I'm also aware that you've got your family members, and so I don't want. So I'm wearing two for a variety of reasons. So a little bit of a departure. I don't know, Josh, if I was lost in some thing, or if I was made a conscious, deliberate decision there to have that little foray. But we have these automatic habitual ways that can get in the way of applying the technique. What's letter D? Insensitive emotions. The other person's experiencing something and we're just sort of insensitive to it. How can you know that the person's angry if you're insensitive to it and not feeling appreciated? E? Insufficient social skills. We're not actually able to really deliver on it. Like, they're feeling not appreciated. And for whatever reason. And we all have our ways. Good enough for sure. We all have our moments. And then the one that should be most obvious, right, from our class thus far. What's E? F.
Focus.
Inadequate focus. We're not even paying attention. Right? It's a variation on the first one, Joyce, that you mentioned. We're so self-centered, we're so self-absorbed that we're not noticing the other person. But maybe we're not. Maybe we're not at all a self-absorbed person. But our minds are just all over the place. Okay. So Professor Riskin lays out how you can have a technique. What's another technique that we've learned? It's on this page. What's a technique that we've learned? It's in the techniques, where you can have it as your technique for interacting with somebody else, but the same things almost could get in the way. Do not interrupt. There's a technique, do not interrupt. You got it right in front of you, do not interrupt. Does that stop you from interrupting? You're very self-absorbed in that moment. I gotta say this. You're not really paying attention. You've forgotten the intention. You're emotionally very agitated. You're caught in your overreaction. In fact, the interruption is the automatic habitual overreaction. So what Leonard Riskin here is pointing out applies in so many areas. And then what is he saying about mindfulness? Because he's saying you can know the core concerns. You can be good at delivering on the core concerns. And then you can find yourself in a situation where, for any of a variety of reasons, of your own nature or of what's taking place, A through F kicks in, and these are obstacles to delivering on the promise of the core concerns that you might have spent hours reading about, going to workshops on, etc. And so he's saying what about mindfulness in this regard? What's his next logical statement? You should come up from it with in your head. You don't need to be looking at it. That's one of the reasons why you don't have all the words.
Mindfulness helps you to overcome these obstacles.
Mindfulness helps us overcome these obstacles. Mindfulness helps us overcome these obstacles. Something to consider, maybe, right? Okay. I guess it is written there, but Dylan, you weren't looking at it.
I actually honestly did not notice
No,
that
I know.
until just now.
I know. See, it was his. I actually, honestly, like there was surprise there. If you were like,
Because I just read it and I was like, oh, that actually says exactly that.
of course, you know that you could have been looking right at it and not aware you were looking at it.
That's actually what happened, yeah.
How do you know if you weren't aware?
Well, because I was like, well, I was looking right
No,
in the general
how can
area.
you know if you weren't aware?
Oh, I don't know.
So you were so excited about your response.
A little bit of snow globe right now, a little flustered.
But hopefully it's a good one. We're in this together. We're figuring this out. But well done. Well done. Okay, so do we all get this? Are we following this? Are we tracking this? Because this applies to so many things. The reason why I love this article and we're delving into it, and we've taken 2 weeks on it, and I'm really going to encourage you to read it again, is because you could fill in the blanks on so many different situations and find this useful. Also, as I indicated in I think one of the videos, he talks about the meaning and nature of mindfulness, the effect and outcomes of mindfulness, what is mindfulness. So let's turn to the next page, the other side. Okay, now let's see if this helps recap what we've just talked about a little bit. Sometimes people who understand the core concerns know how to use it and intend to employ it in a particular negotiation. And who would like to? I'd like to hear somebody else's voice talking a little loud. Just all you got to do is finish that paragraph. In fact, you can start with sometimes people. So we can capture the whole thing. Let's all be looking at it and hearing it. By the way, looking at it and hearing it, what does that remind you of? What did we do earlier today that's sort of similar to looking at these words as we're hearing them being recited? Huh? Okay, that makes sense. There's a specific instruction that I offered you all, something we did. Pay attention to the breath and notice the count, or in and out. Two things happening at the same time. We're listening and we're reading. If you're listening to something and reading something, might you perhaps grab a little bit more of the content? More of the meaning? So who'd like to read? Sometimes people who understand. Please raise your hand. Chris, thank you. And because you're up front, just sort of emote. Or
sometimes people who understand the court concern system know how to use it and intend to employ it in a particular negotiation, either fail to do so or fail to do so skillfully. When they review the negotiation, they regret not having used the core concern system and believe that using it would have produced a better process and outcome. When this occurs, it often results from deficits or faults in the negotiator's awareness.
do we get that? Can you apply that to do not interrupt? Can you apply that to some other, what other technique or thing that you've learned about how to be effective in something? Something a child, maybe you had lit skills, where you learn something and you understand it, you know how to use it, and you intend to employ it, but you fail to do so or don't do so skillfully. And then when you look back, you regret not having done it, right? Can we recognize that that's not an uncommon experience? Especially the skillfully, right? May have done it, but maybe not as skillfully as we could have. We go, oh, I should have remembered to do that or something. And maybe, sometimes that's just beating ourselves up, and sometimes it's a good reminder. So, the key, deficits or faults in the negotiator's awareness. That's where the mindfulness is useful here. If it was its result of deficits in the negotiator's ability to see, we'd be like, get them glasses. Right? Okay. Thank you, Chris. It follows, and this is his principal proposal. Who would like to read that? Yes, thank you.
It follows, and this is my principal proposal, that a negotiator can enhance his ability to employ the core concern system through improving his awareness skills. I focus on one good way to do this, a method of present moment, non-judgmental awareness, commonly known as mindfulness.
Okay, very, very nice. Now, does he say this is the only way? Very important. He's not saying this is the only way. He's saying this is one way. Okay. And now there's something very interesting. Who would like to read the next sentence? The most important part takes us to just the sentence itself, right where the blue line is. It goes on to talk about how there's various Buddhist aspects to the psychology of the mind, and it's brought into the West and athletics and law, etc. But just those from a person to the word meditation. Who'd like to read that and offer, why am I asking you to read it? So somebody with courage, raise your hand. I know you don't know the answer yet. You'll figure it out as you go, or we'll figure it out together. Who'd like to read it? Yes, Brandon.
A person cultivates the ability to be mindful principally through the forms of meditation.
Okay. A person cultivates the ability to be mindful principally through forms of meditation, and I'll finish it, known as mindfulness meditation practices. Okay, so what is that sentence telling us? There's something embedded in there that's really important. We've talked about it before. Yes, Shannon.
I remember
Wait, first, do you want to chime in on that?
Sure. I was going to say, I guess what he's trying to say is that you have to practice mindfulness, and it gets cultivated not by practicing negotiation and practicing trying to be mindful in negotiations, but through practice of mindfulness and then applying it to the negotiation.
Okay, and when you say practice of mindfulness, right?
Like meditation.
Well, okay, good. So a person cultivates the ability to be mindful. He's not saying the ability to practice mindfulness. He's saying the ability to be mindful through mindfulness practices, right? There's a very important distinction. We'll come to that later on. Very nice. And then yes, what that also means is we can practice that technique till the cows come home, right? You ever have it where like Thanksgiving or something, you're like, I'm not going to argue with that person. I'm not going to argue with that person. I'm going to have a game plan. If the person says it, I'm just going to listen. If the person says something, I'm going to say, thank you for sharing your feelings. If the person says something, like, I have to go to the bathroom. And then they say it, and you're like, what are you saying? Like, what just happened? No good plan survives the loved one. Shannon, what were you going to ask?
I was going to say that I remember a past reading that talked about mindfulness not sort of giving you the ability to be present, but it cultivates the like it doesn't give it to you, but it allows you to tap into it because it's already built into your ability.
Okay, nice. So you just said mindfulness doesn't give you that ability. Do you mean mindfulness? Or do you mean something that begins with mindfulness?
Meditation, maybe?
So, well, the word mindfulness is a part of it. I'll say it again. I'll say what I heard you say. I'm going to change the words a little bit, I guess, but not on purpose. Mindfulness doesn't guarantee, doesn't assure it. It's something that you already have. Is it mindfulness that doesn't? The sentence is a person cultivates the ability to be mindful principally through the forms of meditation, in this case known as mindfulness meditation or mindfulness practices.
Yeah, so it said something like you are already mindful, but meditation just allows you to tap into that mindfulness that you have within you.
Okay, so you're already, that's the interesting thing. I mean, would you say that this is a mindful state when the mud is settled and the water is clear? Would that be a right for to be mindfully aware? Yes, that would be right for being mindfully aware. Are we always like that? No. Do we have that capacity? Yes, right? And how do we explore this here? Is it through, is it mindfulness that gets us there? No, that is mindfulness. Right? That is the state for which we would then be more mindfully aware. It's the practice of mindfulness, or the meditation practices. Okay, we'll come back to that again. Then he says in the I will suggest, who'd like to read that? This is just sort of a nice reminder of something very important, but it speaks for itself. Who'd like to read this one? Yes, thank you.
I will suggest that there is great potential for synergy or mutual reinforcement between mindfulness and the core concern system. Mindfulness can help people use the core concern system, and knowledge of the core concern system can enhance the practice of mindfulness.
Okay. And I love that last part. The knowledge of the core concern system can help enhance the practice of mindfulness. This is where it gets to the diagnosing your own state. You know, knowledge of do not interrupt can enhance the practice of mindfulness. How can knowledge of do not interrupt enhance the practice of mindfulness? You go into the conversation. Yeah,
I was thinking, isn't that kind of a practice in of itself?
Well,
It's a technique, but I feel like it's kind of practicing if you're doing it.
Okay, so that's really brilliant. It is a technique. Do not interrupt. Right? Core concerns, you can just have it where you're a robot. A robot. Person, I see, eyes looking off to the side. They're feeling disconnected. You know. And then it's like, list of things to say. I think that, would it help for you if I were to tell, you know, that remind you that you're, right? You don't need to have mindfulness to be able to deliver on that. You don't need to have mindfulness to do not interrupt. A robot would be great at it. Have you finished? I have a thought. You didn't ask me. I share my opinion. I mean, that doesn't take anything except being able to follow an instruction. So you're right. Do not interrupt is a technique. What brings it to life? What has it become?
Being aware of, like, not interrupting.
And being aware of, in addition to not interrupting.
Kind of what's going on, like what you're thinking, feeling, and
Right. That's then it becomes a mindfulness practice. Do we get that? The robot isn't going to necessarily do that. I know, Westworld, we have to reconsider our whole understanding of artificial intelligence, right? But the robot's not going to do that. And if we could just push a button and just sort of become inactive until they finish talking and then sort of perk up again, we wouldn't either. The richness of it is to be in that conversation with a spiral going or a snow lobe and the water is getting, and we go, oh. But here's the thing, and this is where the body scan, which we'll move into in a little bit. It's a way to be in that moment that's more skillful and helpful than just returning to the breath. Returning to the breath, helpful for steadying the mind, helpful for steadying attention, helpful for getting back on track. But if every time I'm thinking about interrupting somebody or having an impulse to interrupt somebody, I just like, oh, I'm back. I'll get a lot of information, a lot of data from that conversation. But, when he said that thing or she said that thing about I became really agitated. I wonder why. Could be very helpful for the very thing that my client is afraid of that. And I don't want to just, it's like, so we don't want to miss that. It's not about just not interrupting. It's about, it becomes a mindfulness practice. The technique becomes a mindfulness practice when we understand that when we're having that conversation, not that we can be aware and can turn our attention to the sensations of the body, but that's here to be aware of. When we were outside, we were doing mindful walking. Mindful walking, I'm aware of the sensations on my feet. That's so interesting. Oh, I like that. Oh, my mind didn't wander so much because I was... Yeah, that's nice as we're beginning sort of training wheels around these practices. But if you're actually walking and your mind isn't so busy, you will be aware of what's taking place. You will be more aware of the heaviness, the solidity, the fluidity of this body. Not because you're turning your attention to it, but because you're not somewhere else to miss it. And then if you're here, you got more of this going for you. Not because it's all about, oh, what a great day. I was so attentive to my body all day long. Scott would be so proud of me. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. I was there for all of that. So very nice. All right, next page. Fisher and Shapiro provide a number of good behavioral techniques. Get the word techniques. To help a negotiator prevent or reduce the power of some of these potential challenges. They recommend that you take your own emotional temperature, asking yourself whether your emotions are out of control, risky, or manageable. They suggest that you soothe yourself, cool down your emotional temperature so that you can be in control. We all get this. It makes a lot of sense, right? We want to be able to do that. And we can, just by turning our attention to it when we're in those moments, we can perhaps begin to do that a little bit, or even a lot. Because even to do that, you have to be what? In those moments? Aware. You have to be aware. So right away, what he says on the first page, which is what? The deficits or faults in the negotiator's awareness. Okay, so even to execute on that, you can have slowly count backwards from 10, breathe deeply 3 times, pause, right? And never even recollect it. Okay, but if you have the awareness a little bit, then we have these slowly count backwards from 10, breathe deeply 3 times. By now, hopefully, you know, is breathing deeply 3 times to feel calmer, is that a mindfulness practice? No, it's a technique for feeling more relaxed. If you're very aware of those sensations and you keep your attention on them, is that a mindfulness practice? Yes. Do you have to be mindfully aware to take 3 slower, deeper breaths when you're feeling really frustrated? No. Will it still be helpful? Yes. But ultimately, and this is what I spoke of in the return to the balcony, okay, these are all nice things to do, and there's other things that we can do. Wouldn't it be nice? There are things to do. And the more we are present for our experience, the more we will be able to not only recollect them, but even have other possible things that we can do in those moments. But he's reminding us here that these are techniques, but we know that techniques can only get us so far if we even remember them. So now let's turn to the next page, and now we'll get into the meat of this a little bit. Who would like to read One Cultivates the Ability? One Cultivates the Ability. If you haven't read yet, very interested in hearing your voice. Joyce.
One cultivates the ability to be mindful by practicing mindfulness.
Ah, okay. Do we get? Do you see? Brandon? Shannon? One, say it again.
Practicing mindfulness.
One cultivates the ability.
One cultivates the ability to be mindful by
Practicing mindfulness, right? So we're distinguishing mindfulness, this thing that we already have, that can come and go to some extent, the clarity in which we're able to tap into that innate capacity. And mindfulness practices are one way to help foster, to help develop that. Very nice. Go on.
The cultivation process can be formal or informal.
All right. Now we've learned mindful sitting. Is that formal or informal? We haven't used that term yet, but now we're using it.
Informal.
Technically, it's formal. It's a formal practice, especially if you do it on a regular basis for 15 to 20 minutes. It's a formal practice, right? But if you're walking down the street and you're like, oh yeah, tree, perhaps, or wind, and you take aware of the breath for a few moments, maybe you just sort of sit down and go, and you actually not just taking a breather, but you're literally being mindfully aware in that moment with an intention to attend to the object for 15 seconds. Stop. You may remember the stop practice. That's a technique also. And also, then that would be an informal practice. And he'll elaborate on that in just a moment. Go on, please.
Formal cultivation involves practicing mindfulness meditation, an ancient set of techniques most extensively developed by followers of the Buddha. In mindfulness meditation, one systematically learns to pay attention to the breath, body sensations, thoughts, and emotions, one at a time.
Okay, let's pause. Are we becoming more skilled at that? Learn to pay attention to the breath. Breath is what element of nature? The wind. The body, sensations, what element of nature? Thoughts and emotions. One at a time, right? And that's what we did. The breath, paying attention to the breath. One object, the breath, the breath, the breath. We've moved to the body. Eventually we may get to thoughts and emotions. They're very hard to pay attention to. One at a time, at first, and then?
And then simultaneously.
You know when we're out there in the, you got this. What am I going to say? Do you know what I'm going to say? When we're out there in the Arboretum, and we finish that practice, and we stand there, we're just aware. We are aware. Thoughts come, thoughts go, feelings come, feelings go, sensations in the body come, sensations in the body go, simultaneously. Today we're going to learn and close with a new practice called open monitoring. There's no object. If you don't have an object, then you're open to whatever comes and goes because you're not fixed on something. We've been fixed on something, the body, sensations, the breath, so that we can steady our attention. Now we're interested in saying, I want freedom. But we can always come back to that instruction when we get carried away. And then, go on if you would.
Informal practice includes a number of techniques that produce present moment, non-judgmental awareness in daily life, such as deciding to be mindful during certain tasks or events. For example, brushing your teeth, answering the phone, waiting for a stoplight to change, or standing in line at the grocery store.
Okay, we've begun to explore some of those, and you can be finding the ones, even Shannon, back to our first class with food, cooking, right? Even if it's a few moments while cooking or eating. How would you be, and now this is just a rhetorical question, because you hopefully will know and have your own variations. How are you going to be present, mindful while brushing your teeth? And you could look at it from a focused attention perspective, you could look at it from a body scan perspective, you could look at it from all these perspectives. Those would be informal, shorter little things, and for some people, it's like, that's what I do. I don't sit for 15 minutes, but boy, during the day, about 20 different times, I sort of have it in where I just sort of drop it in, where I brush my teeth, when I'm eating my first bite of breakfast, and I just have these little moments. All right, and then, as a general matter,
As a general matter, people who achieve a state of mindful awareness cannot maintain it indefinitely. Even advanced practitioners frequently lose it. With sufficient and continued practice, however, a person can become more adept at regaining and sustaining it. Eventually, mindfulness can change from a state to a trait.
and here's a very interesting book by one of the leading neuroscientists of our day, and one who happens to be a primary researcher in mindfulness, Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Daniel Goleman, a science writer, longtime science writer, and sort of the grandparent of emotional intelligence, altered traits. And that's what they're speaking to. A lot of the science of mindfulness, also a lot of the science that shouldn't be taken too seriously because the controls aren't quite right. You know, it's a growing field, so they really try to come up with we have to be responsible as students of mindfulness, as talkers of mindfulness, as writers of mindfulness, but ultimately a very strongly supportive book of mindfulness, and moving from states, moments of clarity, moments where we were able to reestablish this or catch the mud sooner, to a trait. This is part of what I think Dylan, we're communicating on in our some email correspondences about having where it doesn't like, I notice it so I come back to the breath, and no, there's something that's enduring, that continues on, and it's an ongoing process, as opposed to like, okay, good, now I'm back, and now I can get back into the doing, as if the being stops. Okay, very nice. And then, last thing we're going to speak to here, well, we already did this. Section 1 below explains how this process works in general with respect to the obstacles. You mentioned those obstacles, and then how mindfulness can help, as Dylan said, attenuate that. Okay. And in here, he talks very helpfully. Anytime you want to say, I would like to have a better way of communicating what this mindfulness is, look to something that Leonard Riskin has written, because he writes about it, I think, as good as it gets, especially in the law context. So, for example, he gets into mindfulness on page 308-ish, and so on 308, he says, as I generally use the term in this article, mindfulness or mindful awareness means a certain way of paying attention intentionally, moment to moment, with equanimity and without attachment to whatever passes through the conventional senses with the mind. And every practice we're doing is in the service of that, with benefits or effects that are pragmatic as a result of that, without it having to be anything approximating perfection. Any questions about this piece? Any confusion about this piece? Has anybody, and this was the video that I put up, brought the core concerns into your own interactions with somebody, and to see what that was like if you're using this lens in your negotiation with them? Yes, Joyce.
I tried to, because in the moment it occurred to me that maybe I couldn't, well, in the moment I couldn't remember all of it. So I tried to maybe, but it very quickly fell apart. But I'll keep it in my toolkit.
Okay. Yeah. And then with the interaction with Dylan and the way others chimed in, offer what would I do if I realized one of these might be a little bit, to offer something up, right? Or to shift, right? What would otherwise be your next maneuver in a different sort of way.